By my title, you might suspect, and you would be right, that I want to address the things that are going on in America. But how to do so? It was last fall. Last fall, I was headed out towards Rocky Mount. I forget the actual name of the community, but a couple of years ago, I got a tractor, and I watched the papers. I watched Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace to find implements for my tractor. And I had found a plow that I wanted. I had negotiated a price. So off I went on a late fall, early winter evening. And it doesn't just get dark. It gets dark very quickly. And thank God for GPS. I followed Siri's instructions and I found my way to a little house there. And a gentleman, Carrie, maybe about your age, maybe just a little older, came out and he said, "I need you to follow me down in the field. Does your truck have four-wheel drive?" Well, very proudly, I said, "That Chevrolet will go, I don't even have to do this. I just do this." And I go down around the farmhouse and down through the field and behind the barns to one of the sheds. And there's no power there. And he was going to pick up this plow with his bucket and set it in my truck, but it's dark. And I mean dark. So he came out with, you remember those flashlights about this size, the 2D cell batteries, and it's almost brighter without the flashlight than it is. The palest little yellow light came out. And he said, "Here, you can use this to hook up our chain." Well, I reached into my truck and pulled out my atomic beam flashlight. And I actually brought it with me, and of all things, the battery's running down. But he's got his tractor lights on, and that gave a little light, and he's got this little D-cell flashlight, and that gave less light, and I flipped my atomic beam on, and it's like a spotlight. I lit up everything. And he was like, "Wow, that's a bright light." And I thought, well, if you're going to have a light, you want to have enough to do you some good. We are all still getting used to this new world, the world of the coronavirus, the world of quarantine, the world of social distancing, the world of disinfectant. In fact, Jimmy came over here one day, he saw my truck here, and he opened the door, and I'm halfway across the pews with disinfectant wipes, which, by the way, are back there next to the hand sanitizer. And if you all want to really do a favor for the preacher, as you go out, grab a wipe and come back and wipe down where you sit. Because I'm wiping them all down. We're dealing with a world that is very different. And it is surprising. It seems like it's been going on now forever. And a story came out in the last week that I thought was so humorous. It is the story of, maybe you've heard the story of Daniel Thorson. Have you heard that story? Maybe you have. Daniel Thorson is a practicing Buddhist who is a social blogger and an online philosopher. He's very connected to the world. But in the practice of his faith, back at the 1st of March, he went on a silent retreat. He stayed for 75 days in that little cabin. For 75 days, no cell phone, no texts, no television, no cable, no satellite, no computer, no internet, no nothing. Absolute silence for 75 days. I'd forget what Donna sounds like. But because he is an online personality and he has followers on his social media accounts literally all over the country, he came out, turned on his smartphone, and logged onto his Twitter account. He's heard nothing for 75 days. And he said, "Did I miss anything?" He had missed the entire coronavirus experience. He had missed the death of George Floyd. He had missed the protests, the riots. He had missed the lack of certain items in the grocery stores. He had missed all of that. And suddenly he was inundated with the news that the world not only has changed, it had changed more radically than he could have imagined. It had changed in quite serious ways. I've been listening with a great deal of interest as the people who were not on a retreat for the last 75 days have watched and have responded. And I must say that I am at least somewhat troubled by the level of, and I'm searching for the right word, the level of ugly, maybe is a good word, that we have become accustomed to. You've heard the same things I have. The kind of things when you point at this situation, and it's always they. Whether you can pick the side you want, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, whether it's the police or in the case of George Floyd, the black community, it's always they. They are, and then you fill it in. What I have heard most commonly, the language has been different, but it goes something like this. In light of the brutal and horrible and indefensible death of George Floyd, people say, well, that's bad, but they are just as racist as anybody else. So what's that got to do with anything? I don't even justify it with a yes they are or no they aren't. What's that got to do with a man being killed and people sitting there satisfied with it? The other extreme that I'm hearing, and this extreme doesn't upset me, but it's out there. There are many people who are saying, in light of all the things that are going on, there are protests, there is social violence, and in fact, if you don't see it, I'm already seeing a number of predictions about things that are going to happen in terms of clash. And some people who would go to that sweet hour of prayer, they'll say something like this: the world can't last much longer. Jesus is going to come back. And what we mean by that is our world is out of control. And when the day of the Lord comes, God's going to fix things. God's going to go and address what is wrong and make it right. God will right all the wrongs. I remember as a child, one of the interpretations that was quite popular for a while, I don't know how long, but I remember even bringing it, I heard it at school and I brought it to my dad, the preacher, to hear. I said, I understand that God works on 2,000-year timetable. That, about 6,000 years ago, this was by that very conservative chronology that I don't follow. But I said, somebody told me that 6,000 years ago we had the creation and Adam. And then about 4,000 years ago, you had Noah and the flood. And 2,000 years ago, before Christ, you had Abraham. And then you had 2,000 years later, you had Jesus being born. This was in the 1979, 80 range, right in there. I was 14 or 15 years old. And a lot of people are saying at the year 2000, that's when God will bring it all to an end. And I remember my mom going, I've never heard that before. And Dad just nodded. He said, yes, I've heard this. Those predictions of the end of time, those predictions of the return of the Lord have always been out there, and we have passed them again and again, and people go, well, I thought it would have been. This day of the Lord is an expectation that has been with us not just in our generation or just in our century, but all through time. Because of the coronavirus and our quarantine for several weeks where we were apart, I missed preaching some of the grand themes, especially around the season of Easter. So I'm going to go back and touch on those again, and I find that they are very pertinent for the time that we're living in. It was the end of the earthly ministry of Jesus. He was preparing to go to Jerusalem, where he would be arrested, condemned, tortured, and killed. But nobody else really understood that. So the expectations among the people were, the time is near. God's going to do something. Maybe he's going to send Messiah and we'll have the day of the Lord. And they could tell you why. Here we are, the people of God, the nation of Israel, but we are dominated by a foreign power, Rome, with a mighty hand and a heavy foot, dominated the Mediterranean world. And like today, that domination was not felt at the edge of the sword. It was felt on tax day. Rome did not conquer other nations just to beat them up. They didn't want to go and destroy other nations. They wanted to overcome them so that they could enforce their own tax system and put the money in their coffers. So the taxation was an onerous thing. Not only was there Rome to deal with, you had the political left and the political right in Palestine. You had the Pharisees on one side who were politically very, very conservative. There were elements of their theology that was kind of liberal. Then you had the Sadducees, which politically were very, very liberal. They buddied up to Rome. In fact, they got Rome to help them appoint who would be high priest. But in terms of Scripture, they were much more conservative. And if that interests you, I can talk about that with you at some other time. But they had these tensions. And the Pharisees were the people who took religion out into the villages, into the towns. The Sadducees had the power of the temple. Oh, and the temple. You get to be the out-of-towners, our friends here. When you traveled from out of town and you came to Jerusalem, you had to go to the temple. And if you went to the temple, you had to make a sacrifice. A lamb or a dove or a little goat or something like that. But I mean, Blake told me it was a 20-minute drive. It's not like that would be that hard for him. But remember, they didn't have a Chevrolet or a Dodge, whichever the case may be. They were traveling by walking or at best on the back of a donkey, and you couldn't really cart animals all that far. So the temple, being the good entrepreneurial people that they were, they said, well, what we'll do is we will raise ceremonial animals and we will have them in a little stockyard inside the outer temple grounds, and you can come to the temple and buy a sacrifice. It will be kosher, so to speak. It will be clean. It will be spotless and pure. And you can have that, and it will be convenient for you. Of course, the prices for those animals came at a premium. Imagine, Carrie, when the stock sale comes again next year, whatever the prices that you'd get at the stock sale when you take them to the temple, you can get double that. I know where you'd be selling, don't you? So it didn't seem all that pious and holy, but it got better. Not only did you buy your animals at that little spot inside the temple, but you couldn't spend your good old green dollar bills and $10 bills and so on. You had to use temple script, temple currency. So over here, they would have the exchangers table. You know, some of you have traveled from time to time, and you have to exchange your currency for someone else's. And it's never a one for one. There's always an exchange rate. But whatever that exchange rate was, it was quite inflated by the temple officials who provided this service for the good of the people. The other way to say what I just said is cha-ching. The exchange rate was unfair, plus the percentage that they would charge for rendering this service. So when you gave your dollars to them, you got 50 cents. And when you'd spent all your money, I am sure there were other little shops for tourists to get things inside that temple grounds. And when you left and you found out you had a couple of dollars of temple script left over that was a whole lot more of your native script, then you go to exchange it back and they do the same thing to you again. So you take another cut. But it was just the way things worked. That's just how the world worked. And a lot of people had gotten so used to it that they decided there was nothing wrong with it. If it hurt certain people, tough, don't go to the temple. It's your fault. That is the situation. A lot of people were dealing with a tension that says things can't keep going as they are. And other people were saying we've got to hold on to our power and our advantage. And Jesus has had that Passover meal with his disciples. And as they approached the town, he said, boys, I'm going to stop right here. And I want you to go into town and you're going to find a couple of animals tied there. Bring them to me. He is choosing to ride into town as a messianic figure. He is announcing to people that the day of the Lord is here. And it starts in the person of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 21, we take up our reading in the 6th verse, and we find these words. The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the ground, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, who is this? The crowds answered, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. There have been many moments in my lifetime where it really felt good to be American. I remember 1980 when the United States hockey team beat the Russians. We hadn't beat the Russians in forever, and everybody just waved the flag and said, it feels good. And not intended as a political statement, but I loved it when Ronald Reagan spoke of America as a shining city on a hill, the last great hope of freedom. And even the people who would not vote for him would echo that sentiment. America is a blessed place to be, a place of hope. So hope is one direction and despair is the other, or that's what we would like to think. We would like to think that we're working to make a better world so that the American dream is offered to anybody who wants to take it. But recent events are impressing on us that hope and despair often are much closer together than we would like to believe. There is pain in the lives of many who are, like you and me, American. The events of recent weeks have demonstrated to us anew, it's not the first time, but in an inescapable way, that there is something wrong at the heart of this American experience. And some of us, retreat into our faith, as it were, of saying, oh, dear God, come and fix this. And if the Lord were to walk in today, we might be surprised at how he would address certain things. I love, back in the day, I don't know if when y'all were kids y'all had them, but I remember when it was popular to get those little rubber armbands and they said, WWJD, what would Jesus do? One of my divinity school classmates is a pastor now, and she pointed out, sometimes it's not what would Jesus do, but would we pay attention to what Jesus has already done? Jesus walked into the temple, and we don't give full credence to what he did. We understand he drove the animals out and he overturned the money changers, but he ran out everybody who was feeding into the system. Everybody who walked over and says, let me have a dove. Oh, well, first you have to come over here. Let me get the proper script, and God will be blessed by me doing this. And then I'll buy a sacrificial animal, and God will be blessed by this. And I'll offer it on that, and God will be happy with me. They had reduced religion to an external form. They had simplified faith. And Jesus said, first of all, he attacked the people. He drove out all who were not just selling, but also buying. And said, this isn't the way that it needs to be. And then he went to those who had the advantage and he drove them out. All of those people were comfortable with the system. When I started in ministry, my father told me two things. There are two jobs that a minister have. And the first job, he said, sometime is to afflict the comfortable. To deal with those people who have gotten so settled into where they are that they can't imagine being anywhere else. When we become comfortable, we become part of the problem because we see no need for change. My wife could stand up and preach an entire sermon on her husband when he gets comfortable in his chair. And she starts to point out some things that need to be different. And I don't say it out loud, but I must confess, since I'm in the house of the Lord, that sometimes I think, well, honey, it's not bothering me because I can't see it from here. Our level of comfort sometimes is our biggest problem because once we become comfortable, we desire no change. We see no reason to stick our neck out, so to speak. Oh, if we're having an academic, an intellectual conversation, we don't mind admitting that there are things that are wrong, but as long as we're comfortable, it will be up to someone else to deal with them. But Jesus understood that if you are going to go about the Father's business, sometimes you have to stick your neck out and confront that which is wrong. A house of prayer is a far different thing from what Jesus called a den of thieves. I want you to think for a minute of how you would describe or define a den of thieves. Take just a minute and think, what would a den of thieves look like? I think of some of those old Wild West movies where there was an outlaw town and they were shooting it up and beating it up and all those things. A lot of crime going on at these places. A lot of vice. But a den of thieves is not where thieves go to enact their crimes. It's where they go to be safe. Jesus said one of our biggest problems here is the people that are wrong are perfectly safe in the Lord's house. You better think about that one. Because what happens is we become comfortable with our own negativity. We become comfort with our own smallness. We become comfortable with our own prejudice, and we excuse it. We point the finger again at them. You think this is a sermon about police brutality, and it's not. You think it's a sermon perhaps about Black Lives Matter, and it's not. The sermon's about you and me. Because until we break our comfort, we will never be part of the solution. I hear again and again, the world is so much worse than it used to be. And you may have said some such thing. I'm going to surprise you. I don't think it's a bit worse than it used to be. I've had some conversations with some people who are older than me and told me what they did when they were young. And we haven't invented a single thing in our day. But there's one thing that's different. Where is mine? Here it is. In Grandma's day, you didn't hear about it if they didn't talk about it at the church or at the school. But I can take a video or a picture, and I can get on any of those social media sites. If you don't know what those are, there's Facebook, and there's Twitter, and there's Instagram, and there's WordPress, and there is LinkedIn, and there's more of them. And I can push a button, and suddenly I am now a newscaster to the world. And what happened with George Floyd? A teenage girl pulled out her camera and took a picture, took a video. After his death, the police went back to the police station and they filled out a report and said, the man had a medical incident while we were detaining him and he expired. No word about knees on necks. But one person said, I'm going to show you what's out there. If you think the world is worse than it used to be, what you're really seeing is you're seeing the negative side that we used to keep in the shadows. And suddenly you are more aware of the ugly side of life than you've ever been. But it's been going on forever. We are challenged to hear the voices of people who have never heard a voice before. And we must I talked about our comfort. We must confront our own complacency. We must decide, Jesus could have done this. I'm going to the cross. I'm doing something that is big and it's vital. I don't have time for this. But he didn't. Sometimes we excuse ourselves by our busyness. But that's what we are exactly called to do. We also need to come to grips with a reality that I think we have forgotten in our theology. Because, friends, we are a divisive people. I didn't say we're a bad or an unlikable people, but we tend to accept that our world is a divisive place. And then what happens is, when we pick a side, it's we and they. And we dehumanize others. In the war, it was, we're fighting the Gooks, or the Huns, or the Japs. We dehumanize people even with our language, and I won't even use the racial language that, frankly, I hear too often in churches. But if we talk about theology, which person can you think of that God didn't make? Which ones? Which ones are less human than I am or than you are? Friends, we need to understand the source of diversity. God, there's something special about the differences in humanity that God uses to teach us a lesson. And when we hate our fellow man, I didn't say disagree. There are plenty of people I disagree, but I challenge myself not to hate. When we hate our fellow man, we hate the very work of God. What is the issue America faces? I love one commercial or one advertisement I'm seeing that says this is not a Black Lives issue, this is not a police issue, this is an American issue. Or I would use the language, it is a human issue. And since it is a human issue, only humans can do something about it. Yes, God could snap his finger and fix everything, but the strange thing he has done is said, I want to do my work through you. And our world is getting sick and tired of Christian people saying, we're going to pray about that. We're going to call on the Lord about that. And they said, don't talk to me about religion. Show me a different manner of life. And if you do this, there will be a risk to you. Let me change the context. Let's go back about 25 years, and I was working in the furniture factory. One day, one of the guys that worked in my department, I think we worked till maybe 3:30. About 3 o'clock, we were production workers, so you needed to be working. And he put down his tools and he slid outside and went outside kind of the side door of the plant. And someone said, hey, where's so-and-so going? And another guy said, I think he's going to meet his dealer. He wanted to buy a pound of marijuana to sell. But he was a really likable guy. He was a popular guy. We had our company ball team, and he was a heck of a good ball player. And everybody else just laughed. And I said, well, I don't know what he's doing out there. But I can tell you this. If I knew for sure that's what he's doing, I'd be calling the police right now. And all my coworkers looked at me and said, I can't believe that you would speak up. And I looked at him and said, boys, I can't believe that you wouldn't. I said, not only would I call the police if I knew for sure that's what he was doing, I said, if I caught him selling it around my kids, I'd do a whole lot more. I wouldn't call the police, I'd call the hospital. Because what you permit, you promote. And you will be in circumstances from time to time where you see wrong right there in front of you. And you know it will cost you to speak up. You know that there will be a price to pay. I left one church and had about a 60-mile move to make. The church who called me really didn't have the money to hire a moving company to come move me, so several men of the church came over to the house, and a couple of them picked up the sofa, and a couple of them picked up the piano, and so it went. And in a conversation that ensued, there began a debate about whether or not this nation should celebrate Martin Luther King holiday. Well, Rick being Rick, you see, my birthday is the same day as Martin Luther King's. I said, fellas, I love it. I have a national holiday for my birthday every year. And without missing a beat, one of those gentlemen turned to me. This guy had tried out for the Baltimore Colts. I mean, he was all man. And he said, I'm glad somebody besides, and then the language came out. Somebody besides, you know what, gets some benefit out of that. I put the sofa down. It took me about a half a second to think about how to say it, but I said, I need you to understand something. What you think and what you say in your house is your business, but you're standing in my house, and that doesn't go here. I don't tolerate it. His wife was in the next room, and she figured World War III was about to start. But I think I had a pretty good influence on that fella. But it began with a cost of saying, if this ends my employment on day one, so be it. Certain things should be better because you are there. Yes, we are called sometimes to afflict the comfortable, but it's a very famous saying that goes back to a number of figures, but we're also to comfort the afflicted. I included the last verse in my reading today for a reason, because when Jesus had ran out everybody who was doing business, the sick, the blind, the weak, the disadvantaged, the hurting came to them. And the scripture says he healed them. I'm going to paraphrase it just a bit. He loved them, and that made everything better. Perhaps we need to get uncomfortable enough until we would be a safe place for people who are hurting, for people who are disadvantaged. My oldest brother, who passed away 2 years ago, you think you're out in the country? You don't know. Where he goes to church. It's country. And about 30 years ago, they had an old pastor who was kind of withered. He could have played string bean on hee-haw, except he was a lot older. The young girl gave her heart to Jesus. A few weeks later, she wasn't in church. He asked one of the neighbors, said, well, what happened to so-and-so? I have to be a withered old man. What happened to Sister so-and-so? They said, well, her husband's a bit of a drinking man, and sometimes he gets a little rough, and she's got some bruises, and she was afraid to come out. A day or two later, he went to that house, and he knocked on the door, and he knew what time the husband would be home. The husband came to the door. I'm the preacher down here at the church, and I'm here to see Sister whatever her name was. I have no idea. And the guy said, well, come on in. He said, well, I need to tell you one more thing. If she ever misses church again because you laid a hand on her, I'm going to come back and find out exactly how much man you are. Now, a little shriveled up man did not physically threaten that man, but he made a statement. However much man I am, I will stand against what's wrong. Our world desperately needs to change, and God has called you and me to do it. And until we get uncomfortable with what's out there, we can't shine as the bright lights He has intended us to be. Do what you can right where you are. Start. I had the grandsons over at the house on Monday, and then on Tuesday, Quentin had a ball game, so I brought Nick back, and we actually went to Donna's sister to cut a tree that had fell over and was against another tree that she wanted to save, and it had one of those shade vines. You know those things that just weave together like grandma's crochet. And as I cut and all this stuff's laying on the ground, I had Nick there to pull the vines, to pull the brush out of the way. And he's looking at me, and it's all tangled together, and he's like, where do I start? I said, well, start right where you're at. Just grab something and start to pull. I'm not recommending that we get in a van and go to some other place to march, because there's plenty to do wherever you are. There's plenty to do right here where I am. I preach this way because you are the light of the world. You are the hope of the world because you carry the living presence of Jesus Christ. And that light must shine. As Judy comes to offer us some time to reflect as she plays softly, is there a place where you're a little too comfortable? Is there a place where you're a little too willing to let what's wrong stay the way it is? Perhaps the Lord is saying, I could use you. I want to use you. Would you work for me? I'll invite you to bow for a few moments and to reflect on what God may be asking you to do to make our world better. I will just about wager that in many of your homes, there's maybe a kitchen cabinet with a drawer. A drawer that is known affectionately as kind of the junk drawer. There's where the matches are, and a screwdriver, and bread ties, and maybe an old flashlight. And in a room like this, who needs a flashlight? But when the dark happens, you want that light to be ready to shine, to illuminate all that you want to see. Friends, you are that light. You are recharging your batteries here for those opportunities to shine. Make sure that Jesus shines brightly wherever you go, and our world will be a different place. It is good to see you this day. May you go forward with a new commitment to make your little corner of the world as good as it can be. God bless you all.